The number of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people around the world has reached 65 million in 2016. Between January 2015 and July 2017, over 84,000 refugees were resettled to Canada. This refugee population included 43% of school-age youth. Schools across Canada are working with refugee students and their families to help strengthen the resettlement process. Canadian K-12 schools have never received such a high influx of refugees as they have in the last 2 years. This new influx of refugee students disrupted teaching, learning, and settlement, generating new educational debates and opportunities in Canada. To find out what we do know about refugee student education in Canada, our research team conducted a scoping review of Canadian academic literature and educational policy between 1997 and 2017. We identified and analyzed 59 relevant sources published in the last 20 years, focusing on refugee children, immigrant children, aggregated participant groups, newcomer youth, asylum seekers, and English language learners. Academic challenges encountered by refugee students include a lack of comprehensive programs, stigmatization of English as second language learners, disrupted schooling, and skills assessment tests. There is also a lack of diverse pedagogical approaches used by teachers. Students reported that the few teachers who included intensive language instruction and differentiated their instruction helped student learning significantly. Students also noted that the difference in pedagogy between their old school and the new school was a big challenge. The results of the literature review demonstrated a lack of instructional data on educating refugee students in the Canadian classroom. Teachers, resettlement officers, and policymakers across Canada welcome refugees, but continue to lack training in cross-cultural competences, a social justice focus, transformative leadership skills, and policy guidance.
As a mother of 2 immigrant children, my major concern has been their academic, physical, and mental well-being, because my son encountered discrimination, and he was verbally and physically bullied during his initial months in Canadian school. The boy who was bullying my son got even more violent, and in one of the incidents he scratched my son's face and hit him with a log. Despite my son's complaints, his class teacher didn't take note of the incidents, and the indifferent attitude led my son to a point where he started losing his interest in his academics and co-curricular activities in the schools.
Teachers' discriminatory attitudes and psychological isolation of refugee students jeopardize refugee students' self-esteem, social competence, and academic achievements, hindering the students' social, economic, and political integration in Canadian society. Some teaching and learning strategies that were found to be beneficial to refugee students include allowing students to share their refugee story. Multicultural story share is a great way for students to express themselves, gain a sense of belonging, and build friendship networks with the classmates.
Understanding the context and the backgrounds of where these students are coming from. So, for instance, if a student hears a bell and they kind of freeze up, understanding why that might be. Maybe they went through living in war zones or hearing bombings or things like that, like really tough things that a lot of the students have gone through in their lives. So having a little more understanding.
Teaching strategies can be also improved by increasing teachers' and school leaders' cultural competence, by developing one-on-one teacher-student relationships, and by hiring refugee teachers. Clear and high teacher expectations for all students are critical for student academic success. An effective strategy to help refugee student integration is the maintenance of concise and consistent behavioral expectations. Reinforcement of positive student behavior must be verbal, clear, and consistent.
To understand Canadian system of education and to support my children, there were two strategies that worked really best for me and my children. The first strategy was that I would always discuss my children's academic and social integration issues and challenges with their teachers and school principals, as well as with my professors. Honestly speaking, my professors' advices gave me the knowledge and courage to pursue difficult conversations on immigration, bullying, and social justice. The other strategy that worked really best for us was my volunteer work in the school, and volunteer work on science night or any other extracurricular activity that is happening in the school. Because of my volunteer work, I developed a very healthy and positive relationship with my children's teachers and school principals. And at the same time, my children grew to feel proud and safe when I'm around.
The most surprising thing that we found when we first started to approach this research was that just from a logistics standpoint, every province and territory catalogs their information differently. So for example, in Ontario, we have the Ministry of Education and they house all of the documents pertaining to education. Not every province and territory catalogs their information the same way. Some combine it with other provincial services, so it would be the Ministry of Education and a few other services connected. And from previous research I had done, I noticed a lack of information when I was researching Ontario as a context. And so when we went to approach other provinces and territories to look for the same types of information, I wasn't surprised that there was a lack of information available, a lack of policy documents available that addressed refugee students, and that there was this lack of information even after we've had a huge federal resettlement effort to resettle Syrian refugees in Canada.
There was a lot of policy documents when we did searches for refugee students that were geared towards English language learners or English language programs, and that was not a surprise to us because we know that often with refugee students, it often gets lumped in, for lack of a better term, with English language, but there's a lot more to refugee and refugee settlement for students than just language. We need to take more of a holistic approach, and when we look at it merely from a language perspective, it leads to a deficit approach as well, where we're only looking at some of the gaps that students have.
The documents and policy documents that we found that provided useful information for teachers and for anybody who was going to be working with refugee students focused on not just looking at the student as a student, but looking at the student within the context of their family, their classroom, their whole school, the community, them at the provincial level, and even within the federal policies that they have to navigate as people who are new to the country. And so really taking in that context was important, and then developing partnerships and working in a partnership to approach refugee students was equally as important. So not just focusing on that student as an academic being who needs to achieve certain curriculum expectations, but also looking at the mental health and well-being of that student, looking at how can the family help support that student, what community resources are available, and what partnerships you can access.
It is critical to develop cross-sector partnership when supporting refugee students in Canadian schools. Teachers, parents, policymakers, resettlement agencies, and communities can only support refugee students if they share their knowledge and experiences and learn from each other.
As we progressed through this study, we were thrilled that provinces have taken up policy addressing refugee students. For example, Ontario has created a research summation where there's information for teachers to access, and it's readily available on their Ministry of Education website. And there were policies across several provinces that are known to take in refugee students in higher amounts. So we were thrilled that things have been happening and that changes are being made in terms of having policy. And we're thrilled that there have been some partnerships happening, and we're seeing that refugee students are being seen as a worthwhile cause for policymakers to take up. And so I think we are on the right path. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And I would encourage policymakers, educators, and community services to come together so that we can continue on the work that has been started.
Some of the provinces are using each other's resources, which is good. They're also sharing research findings as well. But one thing that needs to happen is more of a trickle down from different levels, so from federal to provincial and territorial. So what you might find is we have a Syrian refugee resettlement program at the federal level, but there isn't much policy or any policy to match it at the provincial levels or territorial levels. So if we're setting up and we're bringing in lots of people, we need to be able to have things for teachers and educators and policymakers to be able to carry that through in their provinces. So that sharing between different levels needs to happen as well. So what that might look like is archiving research documents, archiving policy documents onto websites, because what we found was it's very difficult to find some of the existing documents because they're not properly tagged on different ministries' websites, and it needs to be readable text as well. Open access to policy documents is also very, very important. So again, access, being able to find a policy document in Manitoba, if you're in Ontario, that's all very important for policymakers and educators and people in the field. And then if all documents or policy documents are housed in a repository, that is also very helpful. Being able to also have education policy documents and then community resources as well. Manitoba does a bit of that too. So being able to have community-based research reports and have that available for educators too when it comes to refugee students, resettlement, settlement, that's very, very helpful as well. So not only from the educational policy side, but the schools, the teachers, the families, the community members, a very holistic community-based approach.
The benefits of international collaborations are enormous, and researchers, educators, policymakers and other educational stakeholders can learn a great deal from each other by sharing their local personal and professional experiences and ideas. So international collaboration is a concept which is getting momentum, and there is nothing like collaborating internationally, globally, to share our experiences and our knowledge. Let's work together.